Welcome to Culmination, where everything comes together. In the process of becoming our best self, I have with me the supply chain management student, Carter Nelson, to discuss the topic of connections. And with that said, let's get started. So, Carter, on the topic of connections, in terms of our relationships with different types of people, how do connections with these people differ from person to person?
Well, obviously I can't speak for everybody because that's kind of like, a personal experience, but I think that's what
Sure.
goes into it. I'm sure you've probably heard, like, growing up in elementary school, you've heard your teachers say that everybody is unique. And definitely to, a large extent, that's true. Obviously, there's going to be mass similarities between some demographics, whether you control for things statistically. The fact is that nobody's purely the same, and nobody was raised purely the same, or nobody thinks the same. But that's
Yep.
why each relationship is different. You're not gonna call your teacher mom, except for that one time where you get really embarrassed, and then you have the nightmare again about doing that. But you're gonna treat your teacher differently than your best friend Joe Snow over here, of course. So I think it's just the fact that there are different personalities and that everybody is different. That's where it delineates and gets more complex.
Yeah, I think that's a good description for it. I mean, we're all different in our own way. And like you said, there are some similarities, like us in America are going to be different in terms of our culture, maybe our background or upbringing, compared to somebody in Europe or somebody in Africa, It's obviously a different story. Even just, our cohort, like our generation, Gen Z is different than the baby boomers or any other generation, and vice versa. So, yeah, I guess next I'll ask, why are these connections important? Like, why should I care about differences with this?
Well, I really appreciate the point you expanded upon the differences, because I know in high school I had a talk about like collectivist versus individualistic cultures, and so I think the country and the generation is a perfect example to go further. To go back to your question, why we should care about this, um, you can't survive life alone, really. There's people that try, there's people that will push themselves away, and it's sometimes the most heartbreaking thing. And I remember once hearing a wise man, a wise peer of mine, one time discuss like the broken places of the world, and he said one of them was loneliness. He didn't mean like necessarily like geographical. He means things that like can corrupt a human or can really make things feel worse. And so the fact is that if loneliness is so, I guess pervasive or so destructive to who you are, that's why you need to care about the connections you have, because
Right.
there's a lot of times where maybe you don't realize how important it is, but the moment where you're down on the ground and you're metaphorically and physically, and you're just struggling to get to the next step, you realize that the connections are where you learn from it, but also the connections can be the ones that help you back up.
Right. And there's a reason why solitary confinement is a punishment and why it is considered one of the most cruel punishments that you could give to somebody.
Yeah, exactly. They're try not to, I guess a framework I would have be like, sometimes there might be times where you want to be away, and that's perfectly fine. It's hard dealing with people a lot of the times. Ask me about my college roommates, and you'll know sometimes I get mad at them, but just from that standpoint, you shouldn't always try to be alone, or you would realize, or I think that average person realizes that prolonged loneliness is where it really hurts, and why it's a punishment in the criminal justice system.
Right. And mainly with that detail that I added was like, you wouldn't think that that is a kind of punishment. Like, really sit in a room alone. I mean, I guess there's nothing to do there, but considering that there's other like punishments like manual labor or like community service or well, okay, if you're getting if you're getting solitary confinement, you're probably past the stages of community service. But I mean, other punishments like that, you wouldn't think that that one would be one of the most shocking. But I guess through this episode, we're going to be discussing these themes of not just like why it's important to have connections, but how different connections can look and how we have many different types of connections. Because obviously it's not as simple as like boil it down to acquaintances, friends, close friends, and family. Like sometimes there's connections that are complicated or subtle or with people who you only knew for a short amount of time and other examples. So that's what I hope to get out of this conversation. So
Yeah, I think that's a great way to look at it. I don't know why, but in my mind, like while you describe it, like close friends, family, and all that, I can kind of picture almost like a diagram of circles, and the smaller circles you're closest and expanding outward. And I would assume that maybe some people probably think that way. That's the general way to look at connections. But like you said,
sure.
there's those people you worked with that you don't talk to anymore, or those people that you just had these maybe 1, 2, 3 moments, let's say that, where you barely interacted with them, but for some reason, how they think or how they interacted with you, it really changed your perspective and how you think. And you can't really plot that on a closeness like type of diagram of the circles I was imagining. So
Right.
really on a
It just
simplistic
doesn't
scale,
fit.
exactly. You might think it's simplistic, but like there's a lot of variables, and the more you think about it, I think it's something that it really unravels and isn't so simplistic. It's complicated.
Yeah, that's a very good description, Carter. I wanted to give this example to just showcase how the simplistic model of just viewing connections like, basic acquaintances versus close friends, how you can see how it's a bit more complicated than that. There was this one time where I think it was a Sunday, and normally I get lunch with friends on Sundays after church. But this time I didn't really have anything coordinated, and I just decided to go to the dining court that was nearest to my residence hall. And it was pretty crowded. It was hard to find a spot that was just like, you can sit alone. And this was one of the dining courts that didn't have like those booth seats that are meant for people who are just alone sitting there to sit. So I found a 4-seater that was open and was just, minding my own business. And then eventually it got too crowded. So this random guy asked me, "Hey, can I sit here?" And then he put his stuff down and I was like, "Sure." And I didn't think much of it. I was thinking about just keeping to myself, not saying anything. Because, it's kind of awkward. I'm just trying to eat my food and not really want to be bothered. And anybody else would feel that way. But once he started sitting down, I thought, why not talk to the guy? I mean, he's sitting diagonally from me. Why not? So I noticed on his plate, he basically acquired everything from the menu. And it was reminding me of that SpongeBob episode where the health inspector ordered everything off the menu from the Krusty Krab. So I was like, "Hey, you trying everything off the menu?" And he was like, "Yeah, everything's garbage today." I'm like, "Yeah, I mean, it's okay." I'm like, "I don't know. I think the food's fine." And he was like, "No, I've been disappointed with so many dining courts." So, and anyway, fast forwarding, I started making small conversation with this guy, and I noticed that he had some strong opinions on food. While, I mean, Carter, I gotta be real, like, I have a superpower where I'm able to be happy with the most mediocre of food. Like, okay, I don't like bad food, but if it's just generic pizza from a dining court, I'll eat it, I'm not gonna have problems with it. But you know, some people got their own tastes and opinions on the matter. So this guy was telling me all this stuff, like really critiquing this food. I was like, huh, it sounds like you got a lot to say about food. And he's like, yeah, man. And then he started recommending some places around campus for me to try that I haven't actually tried out, because I'm usually pretty safe. Like, I go to my dining courts and I don't really explore beyond that. And he recommended some places to me, and I was like, thanks. I never actually considered this. And eventually, a few weeks later, I remembered this guy's recommendations and I had a good time. So I know this story might not sound very significant, and it's very nonchalant. It's like, it's the kind of interaction that you would never think about, but you probably have had once every week or so with somebody random. But what I like to think of it as is I had a connection with this guy. He was just some random freshman guy who happened to sit at my table, who I will probably never see ever again. But he contributed to this overarching, like, butterfly effect that is my life, where he recommended, you know, like a restaurant to go to. It's not even that significant. It's just, hey, there's some places to get some good food. But because I remembered that, you know, that contributed to a future event, and I might go to that place more often. So it's crazy to think how these connections that come seemingly out of nowhere can influence the future in that way, even when they're not like that significant of a person in my life, you know? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's interesting because it doesn't sound like you made this like, oh, we go here every week now with your buddies, but it really could like turn into that. I feel like these experiences, you could have loved the restaurants and um,
Sure.
gone from
Yeah.
there. And but that story actually reminded me of a similar story I've had. So I highly doubt I'll ever see this person again. But but over last summer, I worked a couple weeks where I was in Georgia, and I was able to interact with a lot of different people, and it was a different experience in my life. Being out of my normal home state, like learning new culture, like statewide, more rural area.
Yeah.
At this place I was working, there was this one person, and he obviously could understand a little bit of English to get by with the job, but he's from Mexico actually, and so he
Okay.
spoke primarily Spanish. Like that was what he worked, and he was a little bit of an older gentleman, and he seemed to be more of like machinist. You know, one where he works more, a little more solitary. He's not able to talk as much with his peers. So for some
He's
reason,
good at what he
something.
does, though, right?
Yeah, he's good at what he does, but he's the silent type. Not, I didn't
Yeah.
see people going out of their way to talk to him. And
Mm-hmm.
for some reason in my mind, just over a couple of days, I thought, well, he seems decent, you know. Why don't I try to say hi? I feel bad that he's not really talking to anybody. So during break times, I tried to, and I took some effort in using Google Translate to learn a couple words in Spanish so I could get by. And he'd
I'm
wear
sure it
like
was quite accurate.
oh, I'm sure it's so accurate, but but it got to a point where I was able to like compliment his headscarf. He wore like kind of like a gaiter, I'd say, more so than a
Okay.
scarf, but around the neck, you know, because it's hot during the summer, so it's like to protect himself from bugs and keep himself warm, and then I'd also be able to like eventually ask where Mexico is from. But
Mm-hmm.
from that experience, after the few days, I guess I didn't realize how much of an impact I was having on him, and I felt like, oh
Mm.
man, he's cool. This is nice. I'm able to connect with someone, even though the whole Georgia experience was something where I need to learn a lot, and not everything was sunshine and rainbows. But he
Yeah.
actually gifted me. He went out of his way to buy a neck scarf, one of those gaiters, very
Oh my
similar
gosh.
to the one he had, and he gave it to me. And so when I left Georgia, I actually still have that, and I wore it the other day as it's mid December. and Indiana winters can be cold, but
Right.
but it's similar to that restaurant thing. It's like, okay, I have this thing from the future. I highly doubt I'll ever see this person again, but it happened, and it kind of conversely makes you think, what impact did I have on that one time interaction? We can go so self centered and think, how did they impact us? But sometimes we might be impacting them more, and we don't even realize it.
Right. I mean, you've heard the saying, Carter. It's like you are, like who you are is made up of who you hang around with. And you've heard variants. I've heard so many variants of this same saying. I've heard, show me your friends, show me your future, from a guy named Dan Pena. I've heard from the same guy, if you run with cripples, you'll learn how to limp. I've heard from an old piano teacher of mine, if your friends aren't making you smarter, they're making you dumber. It's like it's all the same sentiment of like who you hang around with really impacts who you are, how you act, how your personality is. So Carter and I are in this. We're in like a group of friends. We have some buddies we like to hang around with, and one of our friends is named Kevin. He did the innovation episode of Culmination, and I was on the phone with him one time, and I don't know. I was just talking with him, and he responded to me by saying, "Yeah," just a simple "yeah." And I noticed that the inflection in the way that he said it was very similar to another friend of ours named Aiden. And I was like, huh. I was like, oh, man, Kevin, you must be getting those mannerisms from hanging out with Aiden more. And he was like, oh, yeah. And he's like, dude, I swear, like 95% of me is non-original. And it just makes you think. It's like, even our mannerisms, the things that we say, the catchphrases that we pick up, we're just like, we're like this sticky ball that's rolling down a hill and it's picking up everything in its sight, you know?
Yeah, like kind of going along that. I know when I was a kid, like I probably watched like Minecraft YouTubers or things like that, or maybe some sports, and I pick up some catchphrases or stuff like that. And I think this is maybe, I don't want to go logical, but like I don't know the best word, but maybe there's like a level of, since you're friends, there's maybe like a level of like realization with that too. And so I guess I can kind of delve into these connections. Is there a level of like we idolize our friends, or the people we're hanging out with, or at least such a strong admiration that's leading us to exhibit these, not just like internal, but these more external demonstrations and physical cues from hanging out, or in the case of a celebrity or a YouTuber watching, that leads you to change your personality.
Yeah, I think there's some elements of like, okay, my father's a real handyman, so I want to be a handyman myself. I think there's definitely a level of, um, I feel like there's a psych term about it. Like, you just, social learning. Yeah, that's what they call it. It's like the Albert Bandura, like Bobo doll experiment. You've seen that before?
I'm not too familiar with the Bobo doll, but I'm one of my classes I'm taking right now has discussed social learning to an extent.
Yeah. It's basically just like observational learning, like seeing an exemplar doing something and you're picking up what they're doing. But it's interesting that you mentioned that point because that's more of an extreme. Like you want to change like a large aspect of yourself, maybe even your personality based on somebody that you look up to, or worst case scenario, idolize, as you said. But I was just focusing on like as minute as it gets. Like with this same friend Kevin, I was in his dorm room and I said, "All right, let me park my shoes real quick," because that's just like a saying that I say, I guess, and I probably picked it up from my family. And he was like, "Huh, park park your shoes. I like that. I'm gonna start using that. It's like I didn't even think about it. I was just saying it, you know, because instead of saying like, okay, I'm gonna take off my shoes, it's like just a fun way of saying it. So yeah, it's interesting to see how it's kind of a spectrum, you know.
Yeah, yeah. That park your shoes is funny. I might steal that too. And like
I'm a
as you said,
trendsetter, I guess.
maybe it's not that we're just friends. You're just a trendsetter, Casey, and so is Aiden. So really, I think podcast over. Okay, listen, just find the one friend that knows how to say things intelligibly, and you like the way they say them. This is the moral of the story.
Moral of the story.
Joking, but I think that's true. Honestly, there might be a level of choosing and a level of like subconscious, and you don't realize it until after you started having that happen. I can kind of think of
Right.
like two examples where I started saying something. So, um, my girlfriend, she had a professor, and I never like went to the professor's class, but she told me about it. And he like made calculator beeping noises whenever he'd use a calculator, or instead of saying like okay, like in a super serious manner, he'd sometimes be like okay, okay, something like that, kind of jokey. And yeah,
Yeah.
it's a little odd for a professional, but I'm not one to judge. And so she would do that as a joke sometimes, and even like add an e to her okays in text. And I just started to realize a couple of days ago that I've actually added e's on my okays in text sometimes, not just to her, but to a couple other friends that I
Yeah,
have
you're just
now.
like a sponge. You're just absorbing all this.
Yeah, so it's like it's like it goes down a path sometimes, or sometimes it's directly from one person, but really even something like the yeah or the okay, it's really funny to
Yeah.
think about.
And I know all these examples that we're saying are a bit silly, but I know it must be some aspect of like evolution or, just survivability as a species. Because, I mean, if you're told don't stick a fork in the toaster, you're not going to do it, You're going to pick up that knowledge. And as we're talking about connections, it's like, I don't know, this person who told you could either be your mother who gave birth to you, or I don't know, like it could be some random tidbit that you saw on Reddit. I mean, that's pretty sad if you learn that information from Reddit, but like it's fine. I just hope you didn't try it before, but no, I guess you would have known if you did, but yeah, I think there's some aspect of we pick up information or ideas or concepts or behaviors, mannerisms from the things that we see or the people around us. Um, and I guess moving away from the silly topics, I want to ask you, Carter. One of the questions I prepared for this podcast is, what are some connections of yours, so like important people in your life, that have impacted you the most in terms of your character? Or I guess I'll leave it up to your interpretation, but yeah.
Well, there's an obviously first choice, which is my mom.
Sure.
So she's had to work hard, all to support me and my siblings, all that, and she instilled specific values of hardworking. So that's come into me, and she stressed the importance of personal values, whether it be from like personal decisions or like money management or things or things you should look in your peers. So that's an obvious first one, but and I don't
Yeah,
want to
that
get
sets you up for everybody else.
yeah, and I think a lot of people would say parents, and I don't want to say like you would say parents necessarily in all good circumstances, because I realize there's people
Sure.
with bad relationships with their parents, and sometimes the bad versions, the are what set you up to who you are, but kind of more of
Mm-hmm.
like I don't want to be um you know poor, or like not poor, but um like a poor people manager. I don't want to be treating my kids like you treated me, so it's kind of
Right. Yeah.
inverse. So I'm sure a lot of people can discuss on parents. And then a second one that I think would also touches by there's a lot of like small examples I could probably say like in high school that I'm now realizing as I'm in college, like that were have been laying the foundation as I transition into more and more
Yep.
independence each year of this young adulthood. There's this one uh, youth group leader that I had, um,
Okay.
and really a lot of people in that would just goof off and have fun, and I certainly did that a lot of the times. But the reason why I think him is because he actually facilitated really deep discussion, and he kind of reminds me a little bit of you and how you try to think deeper about like how to self improve or or what is the real meaning behind this, like why do we do this. He kind
Okay.
of instruct me on a path where I can think that way and where I
Sure.
can guide my life based on that. Don't just think it is what it is. I honestly hate that phrase, but like deeper or be able to discuss that and then use those thoughts with your values to kind of aim your direction in life, because life's unpredictable for everybody. Not everybody's gonna have the
Yeah.
exact same path, but I'd say those two people, you know both have really cemented, at least to some extent, who I am. And I'm sure in the future, when I'm 30, 10 years from now, that I'm going to be saying, oh, there's this another person I know, or when I'm 40, it might be different people. But those are just two I can think of like right off the bat.
Yeah. And to get a little deeper in the discussion here, what were, we'll stick with one. What was an example of you utilizing that lesson that you learned from that youth group person, that really changed your life?
Mm.
If you can remember, because sometimes it's like subliminal. And like you said, you hinted at this saying there's a lot of examples from high school, but sometimes you don't realize the impact until hindsight. So see if you can remember, because that would be interesting.
This might be more vague, more so, to be honest. Like, I don't think I can delineate one specific, like, this is what we discussed this specific evening, where it's like
Yeah,
this
yeah.
impacted the rest of my future. Like you said, I think it kind of builds upon itself, or you don't
Hmm.
realize it until after. So, um,
Yeah.
but um, he had a big focus like during my group's senior year of like the next stage. And mind you, this person, I said he was a youth group leader. He was actually probably only like 25-ish, maybe a year older, plus or minus a year. Um, and he was like leading us. So this is actually a younger fellow to be this wise was spoke
Okay.
volumes, because I had seen people that were like he kind of spoke on this path of like this next step, um, kind of being like quote unquote a man, but not like the macho man sense, like structuring the importance of being able to support your own values, being able
Right.
to stand for them if you need to, but also understand yourself too. So
Yeah.
I'd say that's like the culmination of all lessons that came together. And I have like specific incidents where I could like think like, oh, this quote here or that helped me, but honestly, that's more so just personal stuff versus
Sure.
like sharing every tidbit, every quote, or every specific instance that won't provide much value to the audio. But that's
Well,
kind
not.
of his path.
Yeah, yeah. Well, not. My question wasn't necessarily what was the thing that he said, but more of like, okay, so if he gave you insight onto these qualities of what makes a good archetypal man, um, what did you take away from that? Like, how you today, you Carter, the person who's talking to me right now, like doing this recording, how would you say that you as a man have been impacted by that? Like, in what way?
Um, I
Show me how much
on
of a man you are, Carter.
thanks. Well,
I'm just
if I'm thinking deeper about who I am today, I don't know if we'd be this level of friends, to be honest, without that. Because I probably see you, I don't know. I can hypothesize how I see if I wasn't uh, had this practice of thinking deep or discussing something deeper or being able to think this way. So who knows what would have happened? But I could see myself as someone getting annoyed by a deeper thinker or think that I'm my way, keep things simplistic. I don't want to necessarily be able to pontificate these thoughts with you, and so I'd maybe become annoyed at someone with your personality for self improvement, and so I think in that framework, obviously we're friends right now, and I think just like no matter what happens in the future, there's some value coming from this. So I'm glad that shifted my personality, or it's at least either
okay.
affirmed previous things where I appreciate this type of thought, this type of discussion now, or it at least like strengthened it or built it where I can
So to
do it.
clarify what you're saying it's like the insight, and in terms of your own self-improvement, what you took away from this was it gave you more of an appreciation for thinking deeper about things, and then you're
Yeah,
tying that into this type of questioning and or connection.
yeah, I think that's the big thing, at least the outspoken, and then the only other aspect I could think about that is that he was like a physical example of someone that I truly
Mm,
respected and someone that seemed to be he had his faults and he knew that, but he seemed to be in a good place where he was mentally and ethically um, at the state of his life, and still seems to be that way. Where it's like that's the type of person to a level I'd want to strive to, in addition to
mm.
being able to think deeply.
Like it makes you want to be more deep and appreciate those types of things in a similar manner to him. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to put it.
Okay. Because I'm just trying to understand exactly what your point is.
No worries. Of course, I understand that it's probably difficult trying to understand what I'm specifically saying. When a lot of connections are just personal, you can hear it, but
Right.
what the other person is saying, but you don't always understand fully.
And
Like
I'll
that.
admit, I'm picking your brain a bit, so it's you're like, oh gosh, I gotta think about all of this stuff that you probably didn't consider before.
Yeah, that's true. You did put me on the spot, but that's all good. I signed up to be on here, so
Yes.
no complaints.
Yeah. Um. So yeah, those are some good examples, and of yeah. So yeah, can't talk right now. So those are some good examples of people who have impacted you. Some good connections. Now I'm gonna turn it on its head a little bit. Who would you say, or not who, but how do I phrase this? What would be an example of a bad connection with somebody? So let's say an adversary or somebody who's wronged you. What would be an example of somebody like that in your life? Maybe most likely in your past, that even though it was a terrible connection and they're probably not around anymore, or maybe they still are, but uh, how has that impacted you in a positive light in terms of all of these connections influencing who we are and what we can take away from these connections after, after they pass on?
Mhm. I think that's a fair question, and I think honestly, this is one of those things where not everybody has that, or not everybody realizes it until after. I think
Mm,
there's instances that I can think of, but I'm going to intentionally be vague here. That way, anybody that's listening to this, they can kind of tailor it to their own decision. Um, but I guess the
sure.
way you can frame that is Um, and we actually discussed this a little bit together before the podcast, but you can kind of use that almost as an example of who not to be. So say someone wronged you, or you looked up to this person for so many years of your life, and then just at the end something fell through where you're either not in touch anymore, or every time you're in touch, it's it's painful to an extent. Um, and I think the best way to use that is to have a mindset of reflection and have a mindset where you can take something apart. Um, if there's someone that has wronged you entirely, a lot of people might think the mantra, fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice, shame on you. Like you're not going to let someone fool you a second time. You're going to adapt to that mistakes. And maybe that is the right path. Maybe the other path is to use that as an example of who not to be. Not necessarily trying to be preventative of something bad happening to you, but rather taking the initiative or trying to be self-aware enough and improve yourself that you will say, I do not want to become this person. I'm going to act towards not becoming that person, whether it be, daily journals or whatever methods you take. And then there's the other aspect too, where you might have a more middle of the road and you can take some positives away this person. You can take some negatives away. And that's where kind of that previous skill I touched upon, being able to self-reflect that deep thinking comes together and why it's so important. So I'm sure I can think of, maybe one or a couple people specifically like that. But I'm sure that, over the course of your life, Casey, or whoever is listening to this, if you haven't had it yet, you probably will have it in the future. And I think having that mindset, it might sound cliche with the growth mindset if you've heard of that from our school, but the mindset to learn from it, the mindset to adapt and reflect afterwards. I think that's how you best go about it.
And I do feel the need to say disclaimer here, where inherently this show focuses on the essentials of self-improvement. And with that, we're obviously going to look at things a lot more positively than reality sometimes warrants. So I do want to say, like, Carter and I are not naive when we're saying this stuff. It's like, obviously, if somebody wronged you, you're going to feel all sorts of things. You're going to feel cheated. You're going to feel, oh boy, like, you know what I'm saying. Like, it's messy. There's betrayal sometimes. Like, depending on what it is, there's betrayal, there's deception, there's distrust. It can put you in a really bad place, and sometimes for a very long time. So, yes, we're promoting this growth mindset, and I feel like I've recorded over 50 episodes of this show, and I don't feel like I did that well of justice, like, explaining this, because I feel like you could listen to a show like this and be like, okay, yeah, growth mindset, yay. There's tons of that naive positivity, but I do want to say that there is a realness. I want to acknowledge there's a realness to these issues, like, it's hard to forgive somebody. It's hard to, like, whether or not you forgive somebody, it's hard to view it in a positive light, Of course it's hard. You want to, like, your natural human tendency is to damn all these people to hell and say, I hate all these people, Like, you know what I mean? Like, that's what we want to do. We don't want to we want vengeance, man. We don't want to think of this constructively. We don't want to look at our suffering and as a good thing or a necessary evil. Who wants to do that? But I think there's a truth to that, and there's a good level of introspection that can be had there, because and I know, Carter, you framed this as more of a vague type story. Like, we don't exactly know what specifically you're referring to, but obviously there through the midst of that, before you were able to have that growth mindset, there was some struggle. You said, like, talking to this person can elicit some painful memories, right?
Yeah, exactly. Again, I don't want to go too in depth, but
Yeah, of
I
course.
can think of a period where I I had been so impacted by this where I just I like couldn't like eat a normal amount for like 3 days straight. Like I'd go to a meal and I'd only be able to eat like two forkfuls, and
Right.
it hadn't like it wasn't just it got like past the psychological point to the physical point. So I think an important mindset is what you said. Like we're talking about this from more of an optimistic viewpoint or more of a retrospective viewpoint where we can say these things. We're in nobody's
Yeah.
shoes. So if somebody out here is listening and they're thinking, oh, we're just talking some maybe some BS that seems not to be true, or we're not considering the fact that it's painful. I think it is painful a lot of times, and an important thing is not to blame yourself for feeling these things. It's natural. You want to damn the people that have wronged you in some way. It's just after the times of healing and after the times of pain, you eventually, hopefully, can get to a point where you can be that retrospective self, where you can take the lessons eventually. But everybody is different,
Right.
and everybody has this different path. So nothing's going to be uniform for a person.
Right. And the reason why we're even talking about this is because it's good to, like, yes, we're talking retrospectively, but when we can look at the etiology, as in like the origin, the causes of things, then we can see how to handle the future and the present situation. Where, let's say, a similar situation like this is going on, where there's this person who's like, it's hard to talk with them, and you're distancing from them. It's just tough, It's going on right now while I'm talking about it, It's behind the scenes. But perhaps through experience of that before, we can adapt that to our current thinking, where it's like, okay, maybe this isn't so bad. Maybe like you're understanding it more, or maybe you can even stop it. Maybe you can resolve the issues. I don't know, like you can completely flip over your situation because I don't know if you've heard of the placebo effect, but the placebo effect is where you're like accepting or not accepting. Um like you're expecting something to happen. So it's almost like your mind tricks itself into that thing happening. So if you're drinking a drink it looks like beer, but it's not, but you're told it is, you might feel drunk even though you're not at all. And it's with the placebo effect, the reason why I bring that up, there's all these mental tricks like the placebo effect. And if your mind can be shaped so heavily, by just a way of thinking or phrasing things, that's incredible, Like you can completely reshape your entire reality. That's why there's the whole like glass half full versus glass half empty. It's the same thing. It's just how you choose to view it. It's powerful. Are you suffering or are you going through a hard time? Is this unfixable or does it just need time to work on? Are you incompatible with somebody, say a romantic partner? Or is there just something you need to figure out with them or you need to be communicable with them? Not everything's set in stone. Not everything has this finality to it. Not everything is as bad as it seems, but it is if you make it that way, you know? So why not try to trick yourself the other way? And trick yourself in the sense where you'll start to believe it and maybe it's a good thing. Maybe it isn't even a trick. Maybe it was like that all along. I know I'm doing some weird mind effery, but like but it's a consideration.
Yeah,
What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's fair. I know somebody that that has had a mindset of if they're in a hard time or anything like that, they kind of have kind of fake it till you make it mindset, and
Yeah.
You might be skeptical about that, but it's really helped some people, to be honest. Like,
Oh, sure.
you fake being positive. Like, if you're in a stage in your life, or recent events have led you to be more negative, you fake a positive out. Like, you fake the thought that you're a positive person, and next thing you know, you stop faking anymore. It is so acclaimed. So I think it's kind of like that. And obviously, not
Right.
everything works for everybody, but I think that mindset is a way to go about it and shift it. And in the case that, one person is talking about where it is truly like, okay, we might not talk again anymore. Like you said, a lot of times it might be something that is fixable through
Yeah.
communication, through, through open discourse, through addressing the issue directly, and maybe realizing that. And maybe that pain would lead to something better if it taught you to address it directly. But not every time it is.
Right. And yeah, like going off that, it's like this whole video has been about, or this whole podcast has been about connections with people. And it's amazing how, like, there can be things can go so awry when there's miscommunication or a lack of communication or lack of honesty, which creates a lack of trust. And, like it just spirals out of control. And oftentimes it gets so bad that, looking from the outside, it's like, again, using romantic couples as an example, it's like you look from the outside on a relationship that you deem like it looks pretty ugly. You wonder to yourself, how the heck did that happen? Like just last week, like William and Mary were doing so well together, and now it seems like everything is like the shit's hitting the fan. Um, but it's remarkably easy for that to happen. And it's not, I'm not saying that to scare people. It's like, it just means there's a lot you have to look out for, you're taking care of a whole other person, you're fitting them into your life, and there's a lot to communicate about. And again, I'm using romantic relationships as an example, but even just friends, it's like close friends or buddies, or like a work relationship. Like you can use that as an example where you're obligated to work with these people. It's like you gotta figure this stuff out, you gotta talk with them. If there's something bothering you, you have to be able to bring that to light, and I'm opening thousands of cans of worms here because a lot of that's difficult. It's difficult to handle it. It's easy for it to get ugly, but it's difficult to fix it, or handle it. But yeah, what are your thoughts?
I think what you said, hits it like right on the nail. And it's dangerous to be outspoken and talk, and sometimes you're forced into it. Sometimes you realize it's the best decision,
Yeah,
and if it prolongs the future of the relationship, or the connection you have, then it is, um, worth that, doing that. And I think framing it in the terms of a romantic relationship is fair, because that dominates a large part of, lives. Hopefully, you have to interact with that person a lot of the time. But again, I think it
right.
does translate towards these closer friend relationships, or even a workplace relationship. Being open is usually the best way to talk about it.
Yeah. There's a lot there, I feel like I just opened a ton of can of worms. It's like we could go anywhere from here. But I guess I'll ask you, what think here. In terms of connections, like what or I don't know, what do you want to discuss about connections? Like because you brought this to my attention in terms of like the discussion topic for this episode. What made you want to do it? What resonated with you with this topic?
I'd say that thinking back about connections that I've had, there's been some maybe more complicated ones I've had. There's been some really great ones I've had in the case, and there's also been ones where I don't know. I would think that I'd put in more effort than what I'd be returned back, and so just the culmination of all of these thoughts and types of connections made me decide it. And like that last discussion point, I think you know I think it's maybe important noting that maybe in some cases, the listener here or anybody might be thinking that there's this relationship in which they're putting so much effort or they feel like it and they're not getting the return back.
Mm,
But
yeah.
like it could be a friend. You're always willing to go out of your way to hang out with them no matter what because you love hanging out with them. In the case of you wanting to meet one on one or things like that, they're not putting in the effort to do that or something like that in a more simplistic way. And
Yeah.
obviously things can get deeper or more surface level, but yeah, I think that's important to note. And like noting, I don't know if there's really an answer to this, but noting yourself and being able to have the social awareness to know, is it just yourself that's feeling this way, or
Mm,
is it true? And then that can maybe be a sign that the connection you're having needs to be reworked with through that open communication or through, if this is a group of friends, maybe you need a new group of friends. So I think that's
yeah.
something important to know, and maybe it could dive deeper into further conversation again. Like you said, the can of worms is wide open, so you can go any which way now.
Right, but you bring up a good point. It's important to assess what relationship you have with somebody, you know? Like we brought up 3 examples in particular. In this case, I'll lay them out for you. The romantic relationship, the friendship, and the work relationship. Okay? And they're all different, you know? It's all interacting with people and there's a lot of similarities, but with a romantic partner, there's a sense of commitment, you know? You are committed to this person. Hopefully the goal is marriage, and I say hopefully because like I don't know. I mean, I guess you could have there's situations like friends with benefits or whatever else, but that's not necessarily the definition that I'm going off of for romantic relationship or people just dating in the short term. Um yeah, so my definition is people who are looking to spend their life with them, with that person. And there's a sense of commitment with them, you know? There's a expectation that you'll shape up in some way or that they will for you or that some feelings will be reciprocated. Now you can't say it's complicated because you can't necessarily go on expecting certain things because everybody's different as we said in the beginning. But you know, it's a partnership. You figure out the cracks. You figure out, okay, what are we dealing with here? My relationship is completely different than every other relationship I've ever seen, you know, because I'm me and I'm different than Joey over there or Steven over there. And then my girlfriend's different. She's different than Sally. And, you know, like we're completely different. And then our relationship is completely different than somebody else's relationship. So you have to figure out, what are we dealing with here? How do I be committed? How do I fit this into my schedule? Is it worth fitting into my schedule? You have to figure out all these questions, and sometimes it can be overwhelming. But you take your time with it. You take it day by day and you communicate and you figure that out. In the case of a friendship, as you were mainly giving off your example, there's not a sense of commitment. So in some ways it's a little difficult when, let's say, Carter, like you said, you would want to spend more time with that person. but they can't necessarily. Maybe they have a relationship of their own, and that's taking up more of their time. And that's when it gets a little tricky because, you're not obligated to each other in the same way of a romantic relationship. But still, you can communicate with that person saying, "Hey, I would like to see you more." And if they can, great, good for you. You address that to them. But if they can't, I guess there's not much you can do there. Or maybe you can work something out. Like, let's get dinner once a week on Fridays, So that's a way for you to work out a solution to not seeing each other. And then lastly, you have the work example where you're obligated to see them. Not, I mean, commitment is a tough word to use because I guess you're committed to work with them, but it's a very different relationship. But using the example that I had when I worked with people at a restaurant, I worked at a pizza place. When I'm working on the pizza line and there's a ton of tickets, ton of orders coming out, like I have to be ready, and my partner has to be ready. Neither of us can be slacking. And if one of us is getting on the other's nerves, we gotta fix that quick because we're working together. There's an objective. And I guess the objective is similar to the romantic relationship where, and the objective in the romantic relationship is, marriage. And then in the work relationship, it could be whatever the job is. Serve the customer, make the food, make the sale if you're a salesman. You can apply to any job. There's an objective. And if you have partners or colleagues, you're working together in a sense. So it's back to the main point of this, I guess, monologue here. It's important to assess what relationship you have because that helps give you a sense of what the priorities are, and then you know how to address it, because there's some expectations in certain ones. Do you have anything to add on to that? Or subtract if it was bad?
No. It was good. I appreciate those points. I think that's good, and maybe that's where you take the time talking directly to discuss like it might be weird in a friendship, so maybe more so in a like a romantic relationship. And in a workplace, you probably already know your goal is to make the pizza, your goal is to make the sale, or if not, your boss is telling you, hey, you got to make more. But maybe in that romantic sense, you establish what are our goals, like what do
Right.
you look for in a partner? Not just from like, oh, we want marriage, but maybe you might say, okay, we've been together for like, after a year, it could be we've been together for a year. What have you learned this year? What are the same points and what things do we want to
Yeah.
kind of embrace or learn about each other in the future? The only thing I'd like to add is you discuss
Yeah.
this self-reflection and talking and how everybody's different and things might not be the same as they appear with other groups. So and we've mostly talked about this in that level of analysis from like to yourself. And humans are innately social creatures. We innately will compare ourselves to others. And
Mhm.
I'm sure a lot of people have heard, you should try to limit that and all that. But sometimes it's unavoidable. And in the case that relationships go or connections, I think sometimes people might look at these other connections and, feel bad because we keep going back to the romantic relationship. But I was watching a documentary last night, and
Sure.
it was about a female boxer, and on Netflix, and she was married, and things seemed okay before. No one had expected anything to be going awry. Maybe a
Mhm.
couple of like this seems a little off, but like they seem together. They're spending a lot of time together because the husband was also the trainer. He's like, okay. And it turned out that it got to the point where the husband was controlling this female boxer, the wife, the spouse, in this case, recording her, and eventually led to him stabbing her and shooting her, and him being found guilty of second degree murder or second degree attempted murder. She luckily survived. But I that's a really really extreme example. But
Yeah,
but I'm
it
just
works.
saying you don't know truly the in depths of other relationships, so it's hard to compare to others and
Right. It's
from that
impossible.
standpoint. Exactly. The perfect couple over here, they might be have having a fight about the same issue for the past 3 months, and nobody's had an idea because they're very quiet about it in public, and they could be on the rocks of in the case of marriage, divorcing or breaking up, or this relationship here that seems a little more rocky. Maybe they just have a very distinct personality where they make fun of each other, and it kind of rubs people the wrong way, but they actually are madly in love with each other.
Yeah, and I feel like this is an idea that can actually strengthen whatever relationship you have, because you can look at your relationship and think, like, we have all these aspects that I really appreciate that, like, I don't necessarily see in other people, or it works for me because, as you said, be yourself. But I feel like it's like a be yourself because you can't be anybody else. You have your own needs, your own requirements, your own wants and desires, and life goals and lifestyle. It's completely incomparable, as we just established. But it can help to alleviate this, like, grass is always greener on the other side mentality when you realize that, like, okay, Sally and Jim are always having fun. Why can't I have as much fun? Well, Sally and Jim also fight a lot, or they have their own issues, I'm not judging Sally and Jim over here, but, like, but, they have their own problems, just as we have our own problems or whatever else. It's like you can't compare. And there's a lot to like in your relationship. And if there isn't, then maybe there's something to consider in terms of, like, why are you in this relationship? And understanding why can help you in the decision of, is this a good long-term investment, or is it not worth it?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a good way to frame it and think about that.
And you
You
also don't want
know,
to be murdered.
yeah, you don't want that. And another more lighthearted example, I'm sure Case and I seem like great friends, but we've actually been fighting because both of our names start with a C, so we kind of hate each other behind closed doors. Isn't that right, Casey?
Yeah, we yes. I've been sharpening the knife while recording.
Oh shoot.
Actually, maybe I shouldn't say that now. Hindsight, considering this is public. But,
Yeah, maybe don't say that.
oopsies. Yeah, we'll just edit that out, I guess. Um, but yeah, I think we had a jolly good discussion here, Carter. Do you have any closing thoughts before we end this episode off?
Well, I've done a lot of talking, but the biggest takeaway in a connection is um, be open to the challenges that they that present themselves with it.
Mm,
Um, and I'm not saying every challenge is good. Not every challenge is, but
no.
challenges can be a
Sometimes they're
learning.
painful.
Yeah, but a challenge can be a learning point, and in the case that we can't live our lives alone, they're worth dealing with in most cases.
Right.
Any closing thoughts from you, Casey? I feel like I've done a lot of talking, so.
No, it's all good. Oh yeah, like what you said, and I don't know, I think we had a lot of great points today. So I guess one of the takeaways is we have a lot of connections with different people, whether it's our barber or our parents or future kids or our adversaries or friends who become adversaries or friends that become best friends, or it's we have a lot of people in our lives, and all of them serve different functions to us, and we serve different functions to them, and sometimes the functions are for the best, and sometimes we should not serve a function, and yeah, it's a lot more complicated than what we can do justice in an hour-long podcast, but overall, I think we discussed a lot of great topics in the topic of connections, and yeah, thanks for coming on here, Carter. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and I hope anybody listening can gather some good insight that they might not have considered at first. And yeah, that's all I got for you guys today. So I'll see you guys next time.